Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. So last year I did a version of the Parasite tag, which was originated by Shawn The Book Maniac, and that tag was basically you go and find another booktuber's video. It could be a haul or a wrap up, or anything with a chunky number of books contained within it, and books that you've read, and talk about those books, hence the notion of Parasite. Now, I couldn't do it in that particular manner because no booktubers would have had enough books on any one video that I would have read. So I went a slightly different way, and I went onto Shawn's Goodreads page, and I took 2 years of his bales, I think 2017 and 18. And any books that were on those lists that I'd read, I talked about them, because Shawn and I, in some ways, are very different readers in terms of our taste. Although we're about to engage in our first ever buddy read next week. But the major difference is, as you know, Shawn is a baler, and I have a sort of absolutely neurotic need to read a book to its completion, even if I hate every word of it. So I think that's the biggest way in which we differ. So it's going to make the buddy read interesting if it turns out that none of us like it. So fingers crossed on that one. Anyway, Shawn approved of the video that I produced. He didn't regard it as me being a stalker, which is kind of nice. So I have updated it by looking at his bales from 2019 and 20, the next 2 years. And taken titles that I've read that were listed there, and I'm going to compare notes with. I mean, obviously Shawn didn't like them because he bailed, but I'm going to sort of give my reactions to those books. So here we go. So just to say, the first one was actually one still on the 2018 list, which I hadn't read at the time, but I have read this year, which is Crimson by Niviaq Corneliusson, my first ever book written from someone from Greenland. Now, I hadn't heard of this book, and I would never have picked it up under my own volition, but it was part of my prepaid subscription to an independent bookshop in London, where they send me a book every month for 12 months, sort of having judged whether they think I like it by a sort of a profile thing I filled out before the start of the year. And Shawn wrote on this, "I'm too old for this novel, whose prose and characters read like YA to me, bailed halfway through." And I know exactly what Shawn means, because the first chapter of this I hated. It just, like Shawn, I was too old for it. It was sort of a bunch of 20-somethings, and they're sort of coming out and love affairs and stuff. But my neurosis mean I persisted, and actually by the second chapter, which had a different form and a different style, and was the brother of one of the characters who was in jail, broke out and fled Greenland and went to Denmark, and it was sort of epistolary style. He was writing back to his sister mainly about his thoughts on sort of being in exile in Denmark, looking back on Greenland and what he doesn't like about his country. And it's sort of, there's a real tension there between his own sort of incipient outward homophobia and yet his sort of actual homosexual desire. And actually, this book won me round by the end. It's not a great book. I mean, I think I gave it 4 stars. But Shawn said he bailed after about halfway through, which means he read that second chapter, but it obviously didn't do enough for him to win him round. Okay, so on to 2019. Valeria Luiselli, The Lost Children Archive, of which Shawn said, "Not by any stretch of the imagination can this be called fiction. I enjoyed the children. They actually spoke and seemed real. The adults were paper thin and absolute dolts, their heads stuck in books. The intellectual pretentiousness of this drove me up the effing wall, bailed less than a fifth of the way in." Well, I think all I need to sum up my feelings about this is my book of the year, in the year it came out, which I think was 2018 or 19? I can't remember now. 19. Okay, so it's my book of the year last year. I loved it. I sort of know what Shawn means about intellectual pretentiousness, but it didn't strike me that way. It was just because a lot of what the parents were bouncing off were literary things. So they're having a road journey with their 2 kids. They're a blended family, and they're driving from New York to Arizona, possibly, because the parents have both got sort of sound projects. The father's is about the sort of the vanished, was it the Sioux or the Apache? I can't remember now. And the mother's was about the sort of the ghosts of dead migrant children who'd crossed the border but had disappeared and died in the desert. And there is a lot of stuff about what goes into sort of sound art, you know, the sort of literary references and things like that, which I really enjoyed. But, you know, what Shawn said is also what I love. To me, this is the best book I've ever read about parent and children relations. It's as simple as that. Shawn also felt the children were strong, but he didn't like the parents. Well, the first thing to say is the father is a fairly minimal figure. It's really about the mother. And I liked her character. I found her fully rounded. Yes, there's bits where she's reading books either to her son or she's reading books to herself as they fill in the time at some sort of motel. So again, there is that sort of literariness about it. But, you know, I just found that the relationship between the mother and each of the two different children, one of who is her blood daughter and one who is an adopted, effectively, you know, stepson, really touching. And the ending is just, it's one of the books I've had the greatest emotional reaction to. And I know Shawn likes emotional reactions in, you know, when he reads books. So, you know, if he'd sort of stayed with it and ploughed on to the end, would he have got that emotional reaction? Who knows? I mean, you know, I unusually had a really powerful emotional reaction to this. I loved it, and it was my book of the year. So we do diverge somewhat on this book. The next book is Hang Him When He Is Not There by Nicholas John Turner. Now, I was sent this by the publishers to review because they knew I liked experimental stuff. So I was slightly surprised when Shawn mentioned he was going to read it. It's mainly done in flash fiction length chapters, and they're not sort of necessarily characters that recur. I think it's more sort of thematic recurrence. And I remember when Shawn said that he was going to read this, in my coded way, I sort of said, I'm intrigued to know what you'll make of it, by which I mean you're going to hate this. But I don't want to feel that I'm putting anyone off reading a book, you know. They bought it and they want to give it a try. Who am I to sort of disabuse them before they've cracked it open? So I do try and tailor how I put my surprise and scepticism, although in one or two cases now I think I don't pull my punches as much. So it's not a perfect book. It's an interesting book. There is some great writing, and Shawn said, Dan, the opening chapters were so incredibly riveting, which I agree, but the author and his editor really fell asleep farther in. I've just read a chapter and a half and some of the crappiest prose ever, with eye-rollingly god-awful sex scenes to boot. So I can see exactly why Shawn says that, and as a whole book it doesn't work, but there's enough good writing in here that I thought it was, you know, worthwhile. The next book, Crudio by Olivia Laing, which of all the books I'm talking about today contains my favourite Shawn review. Willa Cather, by which I mean I was getting revolted. Willa, by which I mean I, had just ordered a cafe latte. She was feeling fancy. She read the first 6 pages of Crudio. Willa bailed. I mean I. Which is a genius review, because the whole point about this book by Olivia Laing is she's sort of channeling the author Kathy Acker. So it's told as if it's through Kathy Acker, but it's also sort of resonating that it's obviously Olivia Laing. And Kathy Acker is not an author I imagine Shawn would get on with, quite postmodern, to the extent that a lot of her writing isn't even original. It's sort of nicked and sort of cut and pasted in a sort of cut up fashion that Burroughs sort of brought to the fore. And yeah, this book, the best bits of this book are the sort of the when she's monitoring social media for, I can't remember which year this happens. Was it 18 or 19? And basically any major event in that year, she portrays through the social media reaction to it, which I thought was really interesting. But the rest of the book around it didn't really work. It's about a woman who is very solitary, and she's sort of finally sort of coming out of her cocoon, and that she's going to marry this guy, and she's full of doubts and uncertainty about whether she's doing the right thing. But there were too many different things thrown at that, you know, such as the social media stuff, such as the channeling Kathy Acker, for it really to hold together. So I can't remember what I gave this. I probably gave this 3.5. So I know entirely where Shawn's coming from, and I could see that he'd stand for the literary artiness and artifice much less than I would be prepared to stand for. The next book I don't have. I can only assume that it's succumbed to my mould outbreak, and that is Lanark by Alistair Gray. And Shawn has written Nopety Nope Nope. It started out as quasi-realistic fiction and was quite engaging, but then it all got sci-fi and yuck. Bailed less than 10% of the way in. I can't really comment on this other than say I read all of Alistair Gray's work in my 20s. He was quite a formative author for me. But I can't really remember anything specific to any of those books. I am rereading over the course of time all of his short stories in a 1,000-page collection, but the novels I won't be rereading. So I kind of know what Shawn's saying there. And on to 2020, for which we start with the long-listed on the Booker International. Oh no, it won it actually. The winner of the Booker International, The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas-Reinveld, who identifies as they. Shawn wrote, I read 65 pages of this, a story about a very unhappy family and their grief. I didn't feel the slightest twinge of emotion about any of it, so I will not be continuing, which exactly represents my response, other than that I did continue. It's a mixture of the sort of harsh farming life with sort of blood and guts sort of on full show that children are exposed to, with a very kind of austere religious Dutch Methodist or whatever it is, and those two things just made for a very joyless family life, quite brutal, but yeah, I mean, I was left really cold by it. I mean, the twin elements of farm and religion are unlikely to speak to me. I know Shawn is from a farming background, and he initially expressed, oh, this might be interesting, but I think he felt it wasn't worth the time because he wasn't engaged with it, and neither was I. Absolutely agree with Shawn on this 100%. The next one, Molina by Ingeborg Bachmann, who is Austrian, and I think we both were inclined to read this partly for the Read More German Lit 2020. Shawn wrote, nope. That's all he wrote. So I can't judge exactly why he didn't get on with it or at what point he bailed. It's a strange book. I mean, it's really her, I think this is her only novel. She was really a poet. There are some remarkable sections of writing in it, particularly when she's talking about sort of, in a sort of Freudian, nightmarish dream world between her and her father towards the sort of back end of the sort of second 2/3 of this book. You know, they're worth reading alone, but as a book it doesn't really hold together. You know, she's a woman who's torn between who's having an affair with a married man, but lives with another guy, although they're not sexual, although the implication is he would like it to be. But none of that sort of, I don't know. It's also quite a dense read, but, you know, it did have redeeming features, as I say, in some sections, only sections, not the whole. So I can entirely understand why Shawn didn't get into it. But I still got reward out of this book, I will say. Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchior, who's also longlisted for the Man Booker International. On page 32, I had a Melania moment. I assume he means Melania Trump. I don't really care, do you? I hated this book. This is my worst book of 2020, and will claim the title in a month's time. Eric Carl Anderson is a big defender of this book. He loves this book. But to me, it's all about sort of the ravages of poverty in sort of Mexico, and how it sort of debases everybody and brings out the absolute worst in human nature. Wives hate husbands, husbands hate wives, both hate their children or are resentful towards their children. But the problem I had with this, and you know, this is told with no paragraph breaks at all, is it's all one tone, and that tone is shrill. You know, there's no light and dark, no shade, and that may be true of what poverty does, you know, to everyone in a community. But as a piece of reading, it's just horrendous, and I hated it. Yeah. Interestingly, on my Goodreads page, this book has had more. My review of this book has had more likes than any other book I've read. I've sort of posted to Goodreads as read. So I'm not the only one. Me and Shawn are not the only ones. I think there is a bit of a backlash as to how this book could ever be regarded as being prizeworthy. I think that's part of the issue of why I'm getting a lot of positive feedback on my thoughts about the book. Next one, Outline by Rachel Cuss, which Shawn wrote three clunky extended "that's my motto" metaphors on the level of life is a box of chocolates in the first 20 pages, with dire warnings from trusted others that there's little else to the book. I mean, I really dislike this book, but I found it absolutely provocatively fascinating in what it was trying to do. So the narrator of this book is trying to efface herself and erase her voice throughout the entire book. It's a narrator who doesn't want to narrate. She's just had a divorce and she sort of fled her family life to Greece to sort of teach creative writing. So the book is made up of what other people are talking to her about, that she meets, the guy on the aeroplane that she happens to sit next to, the teacher that she's replacing, just these sort of random people. One of the problems I had with it is they were all very literate. Apart from the guy on the plane, all the others were as literate as she was, and it became a very elitist conversation throughout, even though all the people were different. It was provoking, that idea of effacing and erasing the narrator interested me enough to sort of, think about it and pontificate about it on my review of this. But as a book, it's just, it's not a good read. So I absolutely agree with Shawn on that. Ellie Williams, The Liar's Dictionary. Shawn wrote, love etymology. After plodding through 47% of this, I have to say I didn't love this. Not one little bit. Too cute by half, I'm afraid, and not engaging enough to finish. I predicted... Oh, yeah. So this is one where I predicted Shawn would bail, and I didn't pull my punches. And I turned out to be right. I hated this. I love etymology as well. But the setup as an excuse to talk about etymology wasn't very interesting or engaging. It was told across two timescales. It's about a sort of a slightly Heath Robinson dictionary from the 19th century, with one of the storylines being one of the people involved in putting that together. And then it was, the other storyline was of a woman who in our times was, digitalite, helping it go digital. So it would be online. Neither of them were particularly engaging characters. But one of the other things that really annoyed me is that, whatever premise it set up, it dropped. So all the etymology stuff ceased to be a thing as we got more into the two characters. It became a sort of a character study. And as I say, they weren't characters I was particularly engaged with. And also the two main narrators can never speak to each other except through plots because they don't coincide in time. So it became very plot bound. I really didn't like this. I agree with Shawn on that totally. As I knew I would, because I said he'd bail, and he did. And finally, Duck's New Report. All 1,000 pages of it, as we know, by Lucy Ellman. Shawn wrote, so the fact that I read 100 pages, the fact that there was about 40 pages too much, mulch, mare, much ado about nothing, the fact that I see why this appeals to many a reader but not to me, thanks. I'm good. Good, bad, indifferent. Goodness me, what a lot of verbiage. The fact that who was character X, who was character Y, couldn't keep track, too much, overwhelmed by minutiae. Now the first thing it says, I haven't finished this, I'm on page 300. So, but I love it, and I'm determined to finish it. It is an intimidating size book, which means I have put it down 2 or 3 times, which would maybe speak to the fact that it's not gripping and page turning. It absolutely is, but it's also a book I think you can read in sections. 100 pages a go for me. So 100 pages across the week, put it down. And what Shawn says about can't remember character X, Y, Z, I haven't found that being a problem because I'm leaving great swathes of time between picking it up again and putting it down. And I'm not finding that hinders me. And I love the style, and why Shawn's written it as the fact that is the style used in this book. There's lots of etymological wordplay in here, which I really like. I like the voice. I like what she's talking about, where she can sort of veer from the very mundane things about baking to, you know, Trump and things like that. I'm properly engaged with this book. As I say, you may feel that it doesn't sound like I am because I keep putting it down, but you know, I think this is really good. I don't think it's radical in the sense that some people suggest it's a sort of a great breakthrough in contemporary literature. I don't see it as that at all. It's stream of consciousness, you know, as per Joyce and others. Yeah, I'm enjoying this, but I can't say definitively because I haven't finished it yet. So there you have it. That was my updated version of the Parasite Booktube tag. Many thanks to Shawn both for inventing the tag and for allowing me to have a look around his Goodreads bailed bookshelves. I will post a link to the original one of these I did, covering 2017-2018. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.